The treaty hall at Blackridge smelled of old cedar beams and melting snow tracked in on other people's boots, and I stood in the middle of it in a dress someone else had chosen for me, looking down at a contract someone else had written for me, with my own signature at the bottom of it in ink that still looked wet even though I had signed it 3 days ago. Tall windows ran the length of the eastern wall, and beyond them the mountain pass was disappearing under a slow, patient snowfall, the kind that didn't announce itself so much as simply arrive and stay. Whitepine sat on one side of the long table, formal and pale and correctly dressed, the way we always were when it mattered. Blackridge's chairs on the other side were still empty. Security lined both walls, arms crossed, faces arranged into the careful neutrality of people who had been told that violence today would be considered a diplomatic failure rather than a tragedy. I had read that contract more times than anyone else in the room, because reading contracts was my entire profession, and I still could not make my eyes move past the third clause without my stomach turning over. Emergency authority during heats. Residency determined by the receiving alpha. A 30-day window for a formal bonding ceremony. A clause transferring my pack allegiance the moment the bond was ratified. I had translated documents like this out of dead languages for 8 years, sitting in the Whitepine archive with 3 centuries of border agreements and inheritance disputes and scent access rights spread across my desk, telling myself the work mattered because it kept old promises honest. I had never once expected to be the subject of one. My Aunt Icehold sat 2 seats down from me, spine straight, hands folded, wearing the expression she wore when she believed history would eventually agree with her. She had raised me since I was 21. In the specific way, that means she had also decided what gratitude was supposed to look like, and for a long time I had never questioned the bill. She had taught me to drive in the courtyard below her office, patient through every stalled engine and missed turn. She had sat beside me for a week, straight after my mother died, not saying much, just present, the kind of presence that felt like the only solid thing in the world at the time. She had paid, without being asked, for my first designation specialist, back when the Whitepine clinics were backed up for months, and private care cost more than I could have found on my own. I loved her. That was the part nobody outside my own head ever seemed to understand about what was happening to me. I loved her, and she had still done this. The doors at the far end opened, and Kaia Rourke walked in late from another negotiation, unhurried in a way that made the whole room recalibrate around her instead of the other way around. I had grown up on stories about her the way other children grow up on wolves in the woods. Half true and useful, mostly for keeping people obedient. Ruthless, cold. A woman who had ended a border dispute by quietly bankrupting the alpha responsible for it and never raised her voice once doing it. A woman who had removed 3 corrupt members of her own council in a single night and never bothered to explain herself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation. I expected her to look satisfied when she saw the document waiting for her. Alphas who inherited treaties like this usually did, whatever they said publicly about regret. She didn't look satisfied. She read the first page standing up, one hand resting flat on the table, and by the second page something in her posture had gone very still, in the specific way of someone recalculating a great deal of information at once and not liking any of the new numbers. By the third page, she wasn't reading anymore so much as staring through the paper at something behind it. "Who drafted this?" she said, not loudly. The room went quiet around the question anyway, the way rooms go quiet around people who rarely need to repeat themselves. "Whitepine's council," Isolde said, in good faith, as part of the peace framework we discussed in preliminary talks. Aja didn't look at her. She looked at me instead, and it was the first time in my life an alpha's attention had ever felt like a question, rather than a verdict already delivered. "Did you request this bond?" I had practiced an answer for exactly this moment, the kind of answer treaty archivists are trained to give, technically true and structurally useless, the sort of sentence built to survive translation into any language without ever actually saying anything. I agreed to do what was necessary for peace. That was not my question. The silence that followed had a texture to it, the kind that presses against your ears until you can hear your own pulse in them. Isolde's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Somewhere behind me, I heard Piper, my closest friend in Whitepine, shift her weight. the small sound of someone hoping I would give the safe answer so nobody had to find out what happened if I didn't. "Is becoming my mate something you want?" Kaia said, and there was no theater in it, no performance calibrated for the watching delegations. It was the plainest question anyone with real power over my life had ever asked me, and I had no framework for answering a question like that honestly in front of an audience. I could not honestly say yes. I could not safely say no, with Whitepine watching, with Isolde's careful, patient disappointment already forming behind her eyes, the exact expression she used to remind me, without a single word, of every debt I supposedly still owed. "My wants," I said finally, "are not the most important thing in this room." Kaia looked back down at the contract like it had personally offended her. She turned another page. Emergency authority, residency, allegiance transfer. A clause, buried in dense legal phrasing I recognized instantly because I had built my entire career reading exactly this kind of language, that would prevent me from disclosing certain internal Whitepine records after joining another pack. I watched her find that clause and understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that she had found the same thing I had, and that whatever she'd expected to walk into this room and sign, it hadn't been this. Then she tore it in half. The sound was almost violent in a room that quiet, thick paper resisting, and then giving all at once, and nobody moved. She tore it again, and again, methodically, the way you'd dismantle something you didn't trust to leave intact even in pieces, and set the ruined stack down on the treaty table, like evidence rather than debris. "If peace requires ownership of another person," she said, "then you have not brought me peace." Isolde was on her feet before the last piece hit the table. She signed it willingly. "This is a legitimate framework under decades of precedent, and you have just handed both our territories a diplomatic incident." "I am aware of the framework." Kaia's voice hadn't risen at all, which somehow made it worse for everyone in the room but me. She turned back to me, and this time the question wasn't about wanting her. It was smaller and larger at once. "Do you want to leave this room with them?" I looked at Whitepine's side of the table, at Isolde's face gone rigid with a fury she was trying very hard to keep diplomatic, at Piper not quite meeting my eyes, at the empty chairs where my parents would have sat if either of them had lived long enough to be in this room at all. Then I looked at the torn pieces of paper on the table between Kaia and me, my signature bisected cleanly down the middle, half of my own name on either side of the tier. For maybe the first time in my adult life, someone with real power was asking me what I wanted, and had not already told me, in the asking, what the correct answer was supposed to be. "No," I said. "Then you will not," Kaia said, and it wasn't possession in her voice. It was the sound of someone drawing a line and standing, without apology, on the correct side of it. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. The hall did not calm down after that. Whitepine's delegation threatened to withdraw from negotiations entirely, and for nearly 20 minutes the treaty hall filled with the low, overlapping noise of 2 entire councils arguing past each other in different registers of panic. Several Blackridge alphas, watching their leader publicly destroy a signed peace document in front of a rival pack, argued in low, urgent voices that I should be sent home immediately to avoid the appearance of an abduction, as though returning me by force would look less like a scandal than letting me choose. Isolde demanded I return with her that afternoon, framing it as concern for my welfare in a tone that hadn't changed since I was 19, and she was explaining, patiently, why some decision of mine was a mistake. I stood in the middle of all of it feeling strangely calm, the way you feel calm sometimes in the exact center of a storm, and waited for someone to ask me anything again instead of deciding it for me out loud. Kaia was the one who did. She laid out 3 options in front of me like they were genuinely equal, which I had not expected from a woman with her reputation. A neutral mediator's residence, cold and formal and entirely outside either territory's jurisdiction. A protected hotel in the same neutral corridor. with security paid for jointly by both packs, so neither could claim leverage over it. Temporary guest status inside Blackridge itself, under conditions Juno Serrat, the mediator assigned to the summit, would draft and file that same afternoon. Conditions I would be allowed to read and object to before anyone signed anything on my behalf again. The mountain road was already closing under the snow, which made the decision partly practical. I would be lying, though, if I said the practicality was the only reason I chose Blackridge. Juno's document, when it arrived a few hours later, was explicit in a way the torn contract had never bothered to be. I was not Kaia's mate. I owed Blackridge no bond of any kind. I could leave whenever the roads were safe enough to travel. Kaia had no authority over my designation care, no claim on my medical decisions, no standing to make choices for me during a heat without my explicit request. I retained Whitepine citizenship unless I later chose otherwise. I controlled access to my own room, full stop, no exceptions logged anywhere in the fine print. Reading it in the mediator's cramped office, I understood for the first time in days that I was holding a document that had been written to protect me instead of use me, and it felt strange enough that I read it twice, just to be sure I wasn't imagining the tone of it, running my finger down each clause the way I would have checked any treaty for hidden teeth. The guest suite they gave me in Kaia's residence was not extravagant. It had good bones and a slightly worn armchair angled toward the window, radiators that clicked companionably through the night, shelves someone had clearly used and not merely decorated with. It felt less like a showpiece built to impress a visiting Omega, and more like somewhere a person actually lived, which unsettled me almost as much as anything else that day. Kaia handed me a single physical key without ceremony, dropping it into my palm the way you'd hand someone their own house key rather than a privilege. "You don't have another?" I asked, because in Whitepine, keys belonged to whoever held power, not to whoever held the room, and I had grown up assuming that was simply how locks worked everywhere. "Of course I have another," she said. "It belongs to building security, and is sealed for emergencies. If that bothers you, I will have the lock changed." I didn't know what to do with someone offering to reduce her own authority over me, as though it cost her nothing at all. I said something non-committal and closed the door, and then lay awake for hours listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that wasn't mine. Pipes settling, wind against old glass, someone's footsteps somewhere below, until hunger got the better of pride and I went looking for the kitchen. I found Kaia there first, sitting at a scarred wooden table eating reheated soup straight from the pot, reading a stack of border incident reports with the kind of attention most people save for something more interesting than paperwork. She didn't look surprised to see me. She nudged a second bowl toward the empty chair across from her without being asked, and went back to reading, like my presence required no adjustment on her part at all. "You've made everything worse," I told her, because it seemed important to say it out loud to someone, and she was the only person available who had actually caused it. "It was already bad," she said. "You were simply the part everyone had agreed not to discuss. Are all Blackridge leaders this concerned with Omega autonomy, or is this a special occasion arranged for my benefit?" Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face, and then thought better of itself. "Blackridge has its own failures. Ask my council sometime how many of them still believe scent-based hierarchy is a legitimate governing principle worth defending in open session. I have spent 6 years arguing people out of exactly the kind of thinking that produced your contract, and I have not entirely won." She said it without self-pity, a fact rather than a grievance, and something about her willingness to admit her own territory wasn't finished being better made me trust the rest of what she'd said more, not less. Whitepine leadership never once admitted an unfinished argument. They only ever announced conclusions. I ate the soup. It was better than anything Whitepine's formal kitchens had produced in weeks, and I told her so, and she said the recipe belonged to her grandmother, and that she'd ruined it twice before getting the proportions right, which was the first ordinary thing either of us had said to the other since the treaty hall. The days that followed had a rhythm I hadn't expected politics to allow. I reviewed the torn contract with Juno in a borrowed office lined with filing cabinets that smelled faintly of dust and old glue, and it was there, cross-referencing the secrecy clause against the categories of information it named, that I understood exactly what had been built around me. The clause didn't just forbid me from discussing the bond itself. It named transport ledgers, emergency reserve allocations, river access records, winter relief inventories, the precise documents I had been quietly investigating before the summit, after noticing, months earlier, that convoy losses reported at the border didn't line up with what actually left Whitepine's depots in the first place. I had assumed before the summit that Blackridge was stealing from us. It was the story I'd grown up inside, repeated so often it had stopped sounding like a claim and started sounding like weather. The records told a different story entirely. Shipments reported stolen at the border had never reached the border at all. They vanished somewhere inside Whitepine territory, on Whitepine roads, under Whitepine security, days before they were supposedly ambushed miles from where the paperwork placed them. Someone was staging losses that never happened and blaming a neighbor for the difference. I did not want to believe my aunt had built a war out of paperwork. I spent longer than I'm proud of trying to find another explanation. Clerical error, a rival depot manager skimming for private profit. Anything that didn't lead back to the office where I'd learned to parallel park. Juno watched me work through each dead end with the patience of someone who had clearly seen this exact grief before in other people's faces. Kaia never pushed me toward the conclusion. She let me arrive at it the way you let water find its own level, asking questions instead of offering conclusions, sliding a relevant ledger across the table without comment when I'd clearly missed it, and when I finally said the sentence out loud one evening, that Isolde had likely orchestrated some of this herself, Kaia didn't look triumphant. She looked like she'd been braced for it for a while, and was sorry to be proven right. Loving a place and seeing what's wrong with it aren't opposites, she told me that night, when I admitted I still felt disloyal even holding the evidence in front of me. You're allowed to grieve something and still refuse to lie about it. I've buried people I loved without pretending they were saints while I did it. It's not betrayal, it's just honesty arriving late. I started noticing things about Blackridge that didn't match the stories I'd grown up on. Ordinary pack members argued with Kaia in the winter market without lowering their voices, haggling over the price of firewood or complaining loudly about a delayed permit, while she stood there and let herself be argued with, like anyone else's neighbor, rather than a sovereign to be appeased. A vendor scolded her, genuinely scolded her, for missing a council meeting about school repairs, and Kaia apologized like she meant it, and promised to attend the next one, and nobody in the market seemed to think that was remarkable at all, which told me more about Blackridge than any briefing document had. She repaired an old treaty map herself in the archive one evening, hunched over torn parchment with archival tape and a magnifying lamp, because she said she didn't trust careless restoration work near documents that mattered. Her sleeves rolled up and her concentration total, and I sat across from her correcting her interpretation of a border clause from 3 centuries ago, delighted in a way I hadn't expected to be by how visibly pleased she was to be proven wrong. You enjoy that, I said. I enjoy being corrected by someone who actually knows what she's reading, she said. It happens rarely enough to be interesting. Most people around me have learned to agree quickly and hope I don't notice they haven't actually followed the argument. I noticed you noticing. You would, she said, and there was something almost fond in it. There was an argument in that same archive room a few nights later over how a scent access easement from an old winter corridor treaty should be interpreted. That grew heated enough that we both ended up leaning across the same table, faces close enough that I noticed for the first time the exact palette of her, crushed bay leaf and cold stone warmed slow by afternoon sun, something like dark plum skin underneath, a thread of wild mint that arrived last and stayed longest after everything else had settled. I noticed, and then I noticed that she had gone very carefully still, the way someone goes still when they are choosing not to close a distance rather than failing to close it. She reached over once, a few days after that, and asked before she did it, "May I?" and moved a strand of my hair away from where it had dragged through fresh ink on my cheek. Her fingers barely grazing my skin, and I laughed at something dry she said immediately afterward to diffuse the moment, some comment about my handwriting looking more legible with ink smudged across my face than it did on the page, and it was the first time laughing had felt easy in longer than I wanted to admit out loud. She noticed I'd been skipping meals, stress killing my appetite the way it always had since my parents died. She didn't order me to eat, which is what Isolde would have done, dressed up as concern, until it stopped feeling like concern at all. She just started leaving food where I'd find it. A plate in the archive covered against the draft, a thermos on my desk with a scrawled note about which soup it was, without comment, until one afternoon I finally asked her to stop leaving it quietly and just eat with me instead, and something in her face suggested that was the answer she'd been hoping for, without wanting to ask for it directly. I watched her, once, dismantle an alpha councilwoman who suggested in open session that my presence in Blackridge could be useful leverage against Whitepine during the ongoing negotiations. A suggestion offered so casually, it was clear the woman hadn't expected any pushback at all. "She is not leverage," Kaia said, in the same unhurried voice she used for everything, which was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "If any of you use that word again in reference to her, you may explain to the mediator why you believe a guest under this territory's protection is an asset rather than a person." Nobody used the word again for the rest of the session. Afterward, I asked her, half serious, whether she'd enjoyed humiliating the woman in front of her own colleagues. "A little," Kaia admitted, unrepentant, and I understood then, more clearly than the stories ever taught me, exactly why people feared her, and exactly why I didn't. There was a Sunday, weeks into my stay, when Kaia insisted on walking me through the winter market properly, instead of letting me pass through it in silence, the way I usually did. Head down, still half-braced for someone to recognize me as Whitepine's traded Omega. She introduced me to a woman selling preserved plums who had known her since childhood, and who pinched Kaia's cheek without a trace of deference, to a boy of maybe 9 who ran the length of 2 stalls just to show Kaia a drawing of a wolf he'd made in school, to an elderly beta who ran the bakery, and who told me, unprompted, in a low aside while Kaia was distracted haggling badly over the price of cured meat, that Blackridge had needed someone to finally make their alpha laugh again, and that she was glad it was me. I didn't know what to do with a stranger handing me that kind of welcome so plainly, so I bought a loaf of bread I didn't need, just to have something to do with my hands. "You're terrible at negotiating," I told Kaia afterward, watching her count out coins she'd clearly overpaid. "I am excellent at negotiating," she said. "I am simply unwilling to argue with a woman who has known me since I was in diapers over the price of smoked sausage. Pick your battles." "Is that a policy position?" "It is the only one that has ever mattered," she said, and took my hand to steer me around a patch of ice before either of us thought too hard about the gesture. We stopped, on the way back, at a stall selling secondhand books, and I found a battered old copy of a border law text I'd wanted for years, out of print and impossible to find in Whitepine's official archive, because the author had once written critically about the Concord tradition and been quietly excised from the approved reading lists. Kaia bought it before I could stop her, waving off my protest with the flat, immovable patience she reserved for arguments she'd already decided not to lose. "You'll cite it eventually," she said. "I'd rather you have it now than spend another 6 months hunting down a copy the way you hunt down everything else, alone and at midnight, refusing help." She wasn't entirely wrong, and I didn't entirely mind being known that well by someone who used the knowledge gently instead of as leverage. Whitepine negotiators arrived unannounced the following week to press their case with Blackridge's traditionalist faction directly, and I asked for distance I wasn't entirely proud of needing. Kaia took me to a lakeside cottage 2 hours out, quiet and cold and smelling of wood smoke, where a woman I mistook at first for a caretaker turned out to be Kaia's older sister, Lysandra. She was calm in a way that seemed hard-won rather than natural, perceptive enough that she clocked whatever was happening between Kaia and me almost the moment we walked through the door, and amused enough by her sister's obvious discomfort that she didn't bother hiding it, teasing Kaia about the state of the woodpile as though that, and not the tension crackling between the 3 of us, were the real crisis of the afternoon. While Kaia was outside fighting with a generator that had chosen that week to fail, Lysandra made tea and told me, without drama, about her own Concord bond decades earlier. She didn't dwell on cruelty. She talked instead about smaller things, being told which clothes represented the other pack correctly for which occasion, having every private decision read as a political statement, whether she'd meant it that way or not, being praised constantly for her sacrifice until she genuinely couldn't remember, most days, which choices had ever been hers to begin with. She described it the way you describe weather you lived under for years, matter of fact, exhausted in a way that had settled into her bones long ago rather than raging fresh. She said Kaia had been 21 the first time she tried to help her get out, too young and without enough political standing yet to make it work, and that the failure had shaped her sister more than either of them liked to admit even now. She didn't tear up your contract because she wanted you, Lysandra said, watching Kaia through the window, swearing quietly at the generator with a wrench in one hand. She tore it up because she recognized the cage from the inside. Whatever comes after that is hers to earn separately, on its own terms. She knows that better than most people would. Don't let her forget it if she ever starts to. I thought about that for a long time afterward, on the drive back, watching the tree line blur past in the dark. Weeks of accumulated stress finally caught up with my body the way it always eventually does, and my heat arrived early, days before I expected it, in a house belonging to the one alpha whose torn contract had specifically named emergency authority over exactly this. I hid the early symptoms as long as I could, telling myself I could manage it alone, the way I'd managed everything alone for years. Kaia noticed within a day anyway, and didn't come closer. She asked, through the closed archive door, whether I had medication. I did, though I no longer trusted anything Whitepine staff had packed for me before the summit, so she arranged for an Omega pharmacist I chose myself, someone with no ties to either pack, to verify everything from the ground up before I took a single dose. I chose to stay in my own suite. Kaia asked whether I wanted Blackridge's medical team nearby, on call but not present. I said yes. She asked whether I wanted her nearby. I couldn't answer that one right away. You are allowed to say no even if your scent says something else, she told me, through the door. And if the whole philosophy of who she was could be compressed into a single sentence, it was that one. I asked for her outside my door, not inside it, and she sat in the hallway for hours without complaint, occasionally reading aloud to no one in particular, her voice a low, steady thread I could follow, when my own thoughts wouldn't hold together. Later, when the worst of it had me shaking and unable to think in full sentences, I admitted through the door that her scent, faint as it was from that distance, was helping more than the medication had. She asked whether I wanted a cloth passed under the door instead of asking to come closer, and I said yes, grateful someone had thought of an option that didn't require me to decide anything larger than that in the moment. At the peak of it, I asked her to come inside. She asked me to say it again, plainly, fully, and I did. She came in and stayed by the far wall until I asked her closer, and closer again, until I finally asked her to hold me, and she did, carefully, her whole body a study in restraint I could feel even through the haze. Muscles held deliberately loose instead of claiming anything the moment allowed her to claim. I remember warmth. I remember her scent settling over everything else in the room, until it was the only thing I could reliably track. I remember our foreheads touching, and the specific, unfamiliar sensation of feeling safe inside my own body, for the first time in days, maybe longer. I remember falling asleep against her shoulder, and not once feeling like anything was being taken from me in the process. I woke expecting her to pretend none of it had happened, the way people usually handle things said and done during a heat, folding it quietly away into the category of things that don't count. Instead, she told me plainly, over tea neither of us had touched yet, sitting across the small table in my suite in the gray early light, I will not use anything you asked for while in heat as evidence of what you want now. I had to look away from her for a moment, because I felt that sentence land somewhere in me I hadn't thought to protect. When I kissed her for the first time, days later, fully lucid, sober in every sense that mattered, it was partly because I wanted her to understand that some part of what I'd felt in that room had been real, even outside of biology, asking for it on my behalf. She stopped after the first kiss to ask whether I wanted another. I did, and told her so, and the second kiss lasted considerably longer than the first. Piper reached me not long after, through a channel she clearly hated using, all careful phrasing and delayed responses, to warn me that Whitepine had begun telling a very different story to the public. Edited footage showed Kaia tearing the contract but cut cleanly around the part where I'd admitted I didn't want to go back with them, splicing the silence to make it look like grief instead of relief. The narrative that replaced it was ugly and coherent, that Kaia had effectively kidnapped an emotionally vulnerable Omega, that I'd been overwhelmed by alpha scent and lost the capacity for clear judgment, that I'd abandoned people who depended on me the moment something more attractive was offered, that the bond had somehow been my own idea from the start, despite every record showing otherwise. My signed contract, released in full alongside the footage, made the story stick in a way that pure spin never could have. Everyone could see my own handwriting at the bottom of it. I did not handle it well. I didn't cry dramatically, the way I might have expected of myself. I went quiet in the specific way I go quiet when something has actually broken something in me, and I asked Kaia, sitting across from her in the kitchen where we'd first spoken honestly, whether Whitepine might be right, at least about the part where I'd abandoned people who needed me. She didn't reassure me immediately, which I was grateful for later, even though it stung in the moment. If you returned tomorrow and they asked you to sign it again, she said, would you? No. Then you have your answer. I still wanted to go back and confront Isolde myself, in person, rather than let this whole thing be decided in absentia by people editing footage in a room I'd never see. Kaia argued hard against it, and for the first time since the summit, we had a real fight. Not the polite disagreements of two women still learning each other's edges, but something with actual heat behind it. I told her she was starting to sound like everyone else who'd ever decided what I could and couldn't survive on my own judgment. She started to answer defensively, jaw tight, and then stopped herself mid-sentence, visibly catching what she was doing before it went any further. You're right, she said, quieter now. I'm afraid, and I turned that fear into an instruction, instead of telling you honestly what it was. Then she asked me, plainly, what support I wanted if I went. It cost her something to ask instead of insist. I could see that it cost her something, and I loved her a little more for the noticing, and a little more still for doing it anyway. I went back to Whitepine under Juno's neutral protection, alone, because Kaia entering the territory herself would have looked like invasion to half the region, and confirmed every accusation the other half. My apartment felt smaller than I remembered, the way places always do once you've lived somewhere that didn't require you to shrink to fit inside it. Some people crossed the street to avoid me outright. A few muttered the word traitor loud enough to be sure I heard it, timing it for when I couldn't reasonably respond without making a scene. Others, quieter, pulled me aside in doorways and stairwells to tell me privately they were relieved I'd refused the bond, that they'd wanted to say something themselves for years and never found the nerve, and I began to understand, piece by piece, that Whitepine wasn't the unified thing Isolde's speeches always described. Plenty of Omegas, Betas, and younger Alphas were exhausted by her leadership in ways they'd never dared say aloud until someone else went first. Piper gave me copies of the falsified logistics records she'd been quietly sitting on for weeks, hands shaking slightly as she passed the folder across her kitchen table. Our reunion wasn't easy. I asked her why she'd told me to sign in the first place, back before any of this, back when it might have mattered more. She admitted she'd been afraid, that she'd told herself sacrificing one person was better arithmetic than risking hundreds in an open conflict, that she'd repeated that math to herself so many times it had started to feel like wisdom instead of cowardice. That's easy arithmetic, I told her, and I meant for it to land, when you're not the one being subtracted. She didn't offer excuses in response, only a plain apology, no qualifications attached to soften it. It wasn't enough to erase what her silence had cost me in that treaty hall, watching her fail to meet my eyes at the exact moment I needed someone to. But it was enough to start working alongside her again, carefully, one shared task at a time, rebuilding something neither of us pretended was fully repaired yet. The confrontation with Isolde happened in her office, the same room where she'd once sat beside me for a week, straight after my mother died, where she'd taught me to parallel park in the courtyard below, where she'd celebrated my graduation with a dinner she'd planned for weeks. All of that history sat in the room with us uninvited and made everything harder than it would have been with a stranger. I never offered you because you were worthless, she told me, and I believed that she believed it. I offered you because you were the one person strong enough to survive it. You spent my whole life teaching me to serve Whitepine, I said. You never once taught me Whitepine was supposed to serve me too. You taught me debt. You never once taught me I was allowed to collect on it. She didn't deny orchestrating some of the supply diversions, not outright. She framed it instead as prevention, keeping Blackridge from gaining economic dominance over the mountain pass, keeping the pack unified through a threat she could control the exact size and timing of, a controlled burn rather than the wildfire she claimed would come without it. You think I enjoyed any of this, she said, and for a moment her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard from her since my mother's funeral. I have spent 30 years keeping this pack whole, Mara. Whole packs survive winters that break the smaller ones apart. I did the arithmetic the way every leader before me has done it, and I would do it again if I believed it kept people fed and housed and alive. You didn't do arithmetic, I said. You did a magic trick. You made a threat and called it a number, and then you counted me as part of the cost instead of part of the people you were protecting. She still believed, genuinely, sincerely, that I should complete the bond, since Kaia so obviously wanted me now, regardless of how the arrangement had begun. It horrified me that she couldn't see the difference between Kaia wanting me and Kaia believing that wanting gave her any right at all to me. That gap was the entire architecture of everything that had happened to me over the past several months, and my aunt still couldn't see it, even standing directly inside the wreckage of it, even with the torn contract sitting between us like a wound neither of us could stop touching. I left her office that afternoon without saying goodbye properly, because I didn't yet know how to say goodbye to someone I still loved while also refusing, for the first time in my life, to let that love be used as a lever against me. Communication with Kaia during that stretch stayed careful, practical, restrained in a way that somehow made it more intimate rather than less. She sent border logistics updates in the evenings. I sent corrections to treaty language, marking up her draft clauses the way I'd mark up any archival document. One evening she sent, out of nowhere, in the middle of an otherwise dry exchange about depot inventories, "Did you eat?" I answered that wasn't treaty business. She answered that she knew. The messages got softer after that, in increments too small to name individually, the way snow accumulates without you noticing exactly when the ground disappeared under it. One night I couldn't sleep and sent her an audio message instead of typing, admitting I missed the sound of her reading beside me more than I was comfortable admitting. She sent back several minutes of herself, reading an old border agreement aloud in a voice of exaggerated, deadpan seriousness, complete with commentary on how badly it had been drafted, and I laughed while crying, which I hadn't known was possible until that exact night, alone in my old apartment, with my phone held too close to my ear. Then came a second betrayal, smaller than Isolde's but sharper, for being unexpected, from a direction I hadn't thought to guard. I learned that several Blackridge traditionalists had secretly approached Isolde about reviving the Concord bond without Kaia's knowledge, convinced that a formal marriage between us would stabilize both territories overnight, regardless of how either of us actually felt about it. For one terrible moment, I wondered whether Kaia had known, whether any of what had passed between us had been staged with more patience than I'd given her credit for. I asked her outright, over a call that felt colder than any winter we'd survived together so far. She was furious when she found out, furious enough to remove 2 senior council members from negotiations on the spot. No ceremony to it. And when the anger cooled enough for real conversation between us, I asked whether she had ever privately imagined accepting the bond once we'd fallen for each other anyway, whether some part of her had considered it a convenient shortcut. Yes, she said, without flinching from the honesty of it, which somehow made the answer easier to hear than if she'd denied it. It hurt anyway, hearing it stated so plainly. Then she kept going before I could pull away entirely. And then I imagined you wondering, for the rest of your life, whether you'd chosen me or simply stopped fighting the contract because fighting had exhausted you. I couldn't live inside that question with you. I'd rather have nothing certain than something you'd always half suspect wasn't fully yours to choose. That was why she refused to revive it even voluntarily, even now that neither of us doubted what we felt. She wanted anything real between us kept entirely separate from the politics that had tried to manufacture it in the first place. untouched by even the appearance of coercion. I didn't have a response for that beyond reaching across the table for her hand, because it was the closest thing to a declaration of love either of us had said out loud yet, even without using the actual words. The final border attack came days later, destroying part of a medical supply depot near the pass, with evidence planted clumsily enough to point directly at Blackridge for anyone not looking too closely. Whitepine security mobilized within hours. Blackridge prepared to answer in kind, council members on both sides suddenly speaking in the clipped, urgent register of people bracing for something they'd spent months trying to avoid. The peace framework, fragile as it already was, began to collapse in earnest, and the mountain pass looked likely to close for good before the week was out, taking with it every smaller community that depended on it for medicine and fuel. I found the pattern almost by accident, cross-referencing the attack date against the record of emergency political votes that had expanded Isolde's authority over the preceding year. Every so-called Blackridge attack landed just before a vote that needed fear to pass cleanly through council. Piper, Juno, Soraya, and I put the evidence together over one exhausting night in the mediator's office. Papers spread across every available surface, and by morning, I understood we finally had something undeniable. Something that would hold up outside the room we'd assembled it in. Some of Kaia's own counsel wanted her to invade while Whitepine was destabilized and win the whole dispute outright, arguing that the moment might not come again. She refused, flatly, because an invasion would only confirm every piece of Isolde's propaganda and put ordinary civilians in danger for a fight that had never really been theirs to begin with. Instead, she gave me something more dangerous than an army. Blackridge's complete, unedited security archive, including the parts that made her own territory look bad, unredacted, and entirely in my hands. Even the records that embarrass you? I asked, turning the drive over once in my palm. Especially those, she said. Truth that only embarrasses the other side is just propaganda with better manners. If I only ever hand you the parts that make me look good, I'm doing exactly what your aunt did, just with better lighting. That sentence told me more about who she really was than anything else she'd said since the day she tore up my contract. The winter conclave convened at the old railway station on neutral ground, the last building that had ever properly connected our two territories before decades of hostility let the line fall into disrepair. Hundreds of people gathered outside under a sky the color of unwashed wool, breath fogging in the cold, and inside the station's vaulted hall, the air felt thick enough to strike a match on. I attended as the treaty archivist who had uncovered the fraud, not as anyone's mate and not as Whitepine property, and the distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. Standing there in clothes I had chosen myself for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. Isolde produced my signed contract as evidence that I'd agreed to the settlement willingly, only reversing myself once I'd grown emotionally attached to a rival alpha and let that attachment cloud my judgment. I didn't deny signing it. I explained instead exactly why I had. The belief that refusal would hurt people who depended on me. The debt I'd been taught since childhood to feel for every kindness Whitepine had ever shown me. The conviction, absorbed so thoroughly I'd never once examined it, that choosing myself over the collective was a kind of selfishness I couldn't afford to indulge. Then I had Juno display the buried clauses for the room. Walked the assembled representatives through exactly how the secrecy language had been built to silence the very investigation I was now standing here presenting. Piper laid out the falsified logistics, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in months, pointing to discrepancies in shipment dates that she'd once been too frightened to mention out loud in a smaller room. Soraya presented the border security records with the flat precision of someone who had triple-checked every entry twice more after that, her testimony leaving no useful gap for Whitepine's lawyers to work into. Kaia presented Blackridge's own archive, including the violations that reflected poorly on her territory, an illegal checkpoint her predecessor had authorized years ago, 2 smuggling investigations Blackridge had quietly let lapse rather than pursue to an uncomfortable conclusion, and made no attempt to soften them or bury them beneath the more damning Whitepine material. A murmur went through the neutral observers at that, the specific surprised sound of people who had expected performance and gotten something closer to an accounting instead. Isolde's own counsel began, visibly, to fracture around her as the evidence accumulated. One of her longest-serving advisors requested a recess to review the logistics records privately and never returned to sit beside her again for the remainder of the session. A younger Whitepine representative, someone I recognized from the Reconstruction meetings, quietly moved 2 seats away, putting distance between herself and my aunt in a gesture more damning than any speech could have been. I watched the room reorganize itself around the truth in real time, the way water finds a new channel once the old one's been blocked, and felt something in my chest loosen that had been clenched since the day I signed my name to that contract. A pack that survives by consuming the people inside it, I told the hall, looking at my aunt rather than the crowd, my voice carrying further than I expected it to, in that old vaulted room, isn't protecting anyone. It's just choosing, quietly, who to spend first. Isolde insisted, to the end, that everything she'd done had protected Whitepine, that history would eventually vindicate the choices, even if this particular room wouldn't. She lost the room anyway. There was no dramatic arrest, no theater to it, just representatives from both territories, and several neutral observers besides, voting to strip her of emergency authority on the spot and open an independent investigation into the manufactured attacks. The manipulated border orders were canceled within the hour, formally logged and revoked. The pass would stay open through the winter after all. Isolde produced one more thing before the vote closed entirely. The original registered copy of the Concord Bond, the one Kaia's torn ceremonial version had never actually invalidated on its own, a technicality she'd apparently been holding in reserve. Juno confirmed it, apologetically, checking the registry twice before admitting it was true. I could still challenge it legally, but the process would take months. Months I could feel Isolde counting on, to exhaust me into compliance the way exhaustion had always worked on me before, in smaller ways, for years. Kaia could have ended it in a single sentence, could have simply refused it on Blackridge's behalf, and let the matter die there. I watched her decide not to, watched her leave the space open for me instead, her eyes finding mine across the hall and waiting. I remembered, standing there, an old clause buried in 300-year-old bond law, one almost nobody used because historically Omegas were rarely permitted to invoke it without an Alpha's cooperation. A Concord bond became void the moment the offered party publicly withdrew consent before formal scent registration. No permission required from either pack. I said the words clearly enough for the whole hall to hear them, my voice not shaking the way I expected it to. Then I tore the registered original in half myself, and again, the sound just as sharp in that vaulted room as it had been the first time. Except this time, it wasn't someone else choosing for me. It was mine, start to finish, and it felt like exactly that. I did not move into Blackridge and become Kaia's mate the following week, however much some part of me wanted the simplicity of that ending. I needed first to find out who I was when I wasn't serving Whitepine, wasn't investigating Whitepine, wasn't defending or grieving or fighting Whitepine in one form or another. I took a position with Juno's Neutral Treaty Commission and rented a small apartment in the city that had grown up around the restored railway line, equal distance from both territories and belonging fully to neither, my name on the lease and nobody else's. Kaia supported the decision, visibly wishing at times that I'd stayed, and visited only when invited, which she managed with more discipline than I expected, from a woman capable of dismantling a hostile council in 5 sentences flat. She took the train instead of sending a car, arriving with snow still melting on her shoulders. She was catastrophically bad at assembling the cheap furniture I'd bought for my new apartment, swearing at an Allen wrench with the same focused fury she usually reserved for corrupt alphas, refusing my offers to help until she'd exhausted every possible wrong approach first. I visited Blackridge because I wanted to, not because anyone required it of me anymore. She sat through Whitepine Reconstruction meetings without needing me there to mediate every sentence between the two sides. I started seeing Piper again, slowly, over coffee at first, and then longer visits, the friendship rebuilding itself on steadier ground than before, tested now in ways it hadn't been. I joined a support group for Omegas, navigating the aftermath of coercive pack expectations, and found, to my surprise, how many of us there were, sitting in a borrowed community room comparing versions of the same story with different names attached. Kaia talked to Lysandra more than she used to, about the specific fear of becoming controlling without ever meaning to, and came back from those conversations quieter and more deliberately careful with me, in a way I noticed and never mentioned needing. Months passed like that. Ordinary ones, mostly, which felt like its own kind of miracle after a year that had contained almost nothing ordinary at all. The support group met on Wednesday evenings in a community room that smelled permanently of instant coffee, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle that nobody ever quite managed to close all the way. The first night I went, I sat near the door with my coat still on, half convinced I would leave before anyone noticed I'd arrived. A woman perhaps 10 years older than me was describing, in a flat, practiced voice, how her own family had framed a bond offer as an honor for 3 straight years before she'd finally understood it as a threat wearing nicer clothes. Another, younger than I was, talked about the specific exhaustion of being praised constantly for a sacrifice she'd never agreed to make in the first place, how the praise had somehow been worse than open cruelty because it left her no clean way to be angry. I didn't speak that first night. I went back the second week anyway, and the third, and eventually found myself telling a room full of strangers about a contract with my own signature on it, about a torn piece of paper on a treaty table, about an aunt who had taught me to drive and then taught me I was expendable in the same lifetime. Nobody there flinched at any of it. Nobody told me I should be grateful for how it had ended. I hadn't realized, until I felt its absence in that room, how much of every conversation about my life I had spent bracing for exactly that kind of correction. I told Kaia about it eventually, expecting her to ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. She didn't. She just asked whether the coffee was as bad as community room coffee always was, and when I said it was worse, she started leaving a decent bag of it in my kitchen every few weeks without being asked, the way she'd once left soup, and I understood it as the same sentence in a different shape. The confession, when it finally came, happened on the restored railway platform at dusk, after a full day spent reviewing the new peace charter line by line in a borrowed office that smelled of fresh paper and cold coffee. Trains ran freely between the territories now, something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier, their lit windows sliding past like a string of small, deliberate promises. Kaia mentioned, almost as an aside, buttoning her coat against the cold, that Blackridge traditionalists had asked whether she intended to formally court me, treating the question as though it were still theirs to have an opinion on. "What did you tell them?" I asked. That it was none of their business. I laughed, and then asked what she actually wanted, since apparently other people kept asking on my behalf, as though I weren't standing right there capable of asking myself. She answered honestly, without her usual restraint, watching a train pull slowly out toward Whitepine. She wanted mornings, arguments, shared meals, me correcting her legal language until the day one of us died of old age, arguing about a comma. Me falling asleep on her shoulder, pretending I was still reading, the book slipping slowly from my hand while she pretended not to notice. But she didn't want any of it, she said, turning to face me fully now. If I ever had to describe staying with her as a sacrifice, if any part of it ever felt like something owed rather than something chosen. I told her I loved her first, deliberately, because the entire shape of my life since that torn contract had been about learning to choose rather than being chosen for, and this was one more choice I intended to make out loud, on my own terms, in my own timing. She went very still, overwhelmed in a way I'd rarely seen from her, the composure that governed council chambers slipping for just a moment, and then told me she loved me too, and the kiss that followed held everything the year had cost both of us to earn, unhurried and entirely certain. We didn't rush toward a formal bond after that either. When we finally did discuss it, months later, sitting at my kitchen table with tea going cold between us, the conversation was as practical as it was romantic. Legal consequences, medical consequences, scent compatibility we'd already tested more than either of us would admit to in public, where we'd actually live, and how often, how our finances and careers would stay separate enough to stay unmistakably ours. Heat support built around what I actually wanted, rather than what tradition assumed I should want. And, at my insistence, clear termination rights spelled out in full. because I told her I had spent my entire career reading terrible contracts and refused to enter a permanent one without writing a good one myself, one that would survive scrutiny from someone as thorough as I was. She agreed immediately, delighted rather than offended by the demand, and we wrote our own agreement together over several long evenings, word by word, every clause protecting exactly the independence the first contract had tried to strip from me, clause by clause. Before either of us signed it, she asked, the way she always asked, steady and unhurried, "Do you want this?" "Yes," I told her, without hesitation, and meant it completely, more completely than I had ever meant anything. The bonding itself was quiet, private, entirely ours. No ceremony beyond what I wanted, no political audience gathered to witness it, no heat clouding either of our judgment in the moment. Just trust and scent, and her hand asking permission before every touch out of habit, rather than obligation. Foreheads together in the low lamplight, quiet laughter over nothing in particular. A few tears neither of us bothered explaining afterward, and the specific, startling realization, somewhere in the middle of it, that a bond freely chosen felt like an entirely different thing in the body than one demanded as payment ever could have. A year after the Treaty Hall, Whitepine and Blackridge operated under a shared peace charter that formally outlawed Concord bonds in both territories for good. No loopholes left standing in the old law for anyone to rediscover later. An independent treaty council now included omegas and betas, with full voting authority beside the alphas, seats that hadn't existed the year before. I led a regional legal project helping other omegas challenge old coercive bond agreements, still lingering in more conservative territories, respected finally for the work itself, rather than for who I belonged to, or what bloodline I carried. Kaia remained Blackridge's alpha, still feared in the council chamber when it mattered, still capable of dismantling a bad argument in under a minute flat. At home, though, I saw sides of her almost no one else did. Irritated, not really, that my legal paperwork had permanently colonized half our dining table and refused to be organized into anything resembling a system. Exasperated in a fond way when I stole her sweaters and wore them until they smelled entirely like me. Still asking before she scented me on the hard days out of habit that had never worn off, and I suspected never would. I teased her sometimes about the first contract she'd destroyed, asked her if she regretted the theatrics of it. She always said the same thing, that she'd tear it up again without hesitating, even knowing everything it would cost her politically, and I believed her completely every time. Lysandra visited more often than she used to, staying in the spare room for a week at a time, and told me once, watching her sister across a crowded kitchen during one of those visits, that she'd never seen Kaia this settled in her own life. Not once. Not even before everything that had happened to her own bond had hardened something in both of them. She and Kaia had started taking long, wordless walks along the lake whenever she visited, the kind of walks that repaired something slowly instead of all at once, and I never asked what they talked about out there, understanding it belonged to the two of them and not to me. Piper and I found our way back to something like the friendship we'd had before, sturdier for having survived what it survived, tested and repaired rather than merely preserved. She came to the wedding, if you could call the quiet gathering we eventually held a wedding, and cried through most of it, and told me afterward, half laughing at herself, that she'd promised herself years ago she wouldn't be the sentimental one between us, and had clearly lost that particular argument. I moved freely between both territories now, belonging fully to neither and welcome in both, which felt like its own kind of victory nobody had thought to promise me at the start of any of this. Isolde's investigation concluded 8 months after the conclave, quietly, without the spectacle either of us might once have expected. She was permitted to remain in Whitepine, stripped of any formal authority, living in a smaller house on the edge of the district she'd once governed. I visited her twice that first year. Neither visit resolved anything cleanly. She still believed, mostly, that she had done what leadership required. I still loved her, mostly, in the complicated, unfinished way you love someone who raised you, and also nearly consumed you in the same set of hands. We didn't reconcile so much as arrive at a kind of careful truce. Two people who would never fully agree on what had happened between us, but who could, occasionally, still sit across a table and talk about something else entirely. The weather, a book, a memory from before any of it that neither of us had ruined yet. On the anniversary of the summit, a new peace agreement was signed in the same treaty hall where everything had started, this time with an entirely different shape to it. No marriage clause anywhere in the text. No Omega exchange written into any appendix. No cent rights transferred like property between packs under any circumstance. A clear section, one I'd helped draft myself over long weeks, protecting individual autonomy from political agreements for good, language specific enough that no future council could quietly reinterpret it back into something smaller. I signed as an independent treaty representative. Kaia signed for Blackridge, a newly elected Whitepine representative, someone who'd been quietly organizing against Isolde's leadership for years, before any of us knew her name, signed on Whitepine's behalf. After the room emptied, I found one small torn corner of the original Concord bond, somehow overlooked all this time, wedged behind an archive cabinet where it must have drifted the day Kaia first tore it apart in front of both our packs. Kaia found me holding it and asked whether I wanted to keep it. No, I said, and meant it, and we filed it together into the archive marked legally void, where it belonged, sliding the drawer shut with a small final sound that felt more satisfying than I expected. "Are you coming home?" She asked me afterward, out on the platform where trains now ran clean through the restored pass toward both our territories at once, snow starting to fall again in the same slow, unhurried way it had the day all of this began, and I understood, hearing it, that the word didn't mean ownership anymore, hadn't meant that in a long time, if it ever really had for her at all. It meant an invitation I was entirely free to refuse, offered without any expectation attached to the asking. I chose yes anyway, the way I'd learned to choose everything now, out loud and on purpose and without needing anyone's permission, and we walked to the train together while the snow came down slow and unhurried behind us. The same kind of snow that had been falling the day someone finally asked me what I wanted, and waited, actually waited, patient and unafraid of the answer, to hear it.